The National Famine Museum at Strokestown Park and Irish Heritage Trust are screening this film as part of the Great Famine Voices Roadshow 2020 online event series. The Great Famine Voices Roadshow is funded by the Government of Ireland Emigrant Support Programme.
By 1847, many people felt the only way they could survive is if they left Ireland. The potato crop had failed. In 1846, the failure was almost total. And so people were afraid, some, that they were being punished by God. And unless they left Ireland, they really had no hope of survival. And part of the tragedy and the irony is that really so many of them died on the voyage, when they arrived in their destinations, or within a short time of arriving there. So although they saw the voyage as a voyage of survival, in fact many of them didn't survive. But they did feel that there was no hope of that for them if they remained in Ireland.
During the Irish famine migration in 1847, over 100,000 people fled to Canada on ramshackle vessels that became known as coffin ships. Approximately 20,000 of them perished at sea and in fever sheds at the Grosse Ile quarantine station on the St. Lawrence River, north of Quebec City, and then in the city of Montreal. They died mainly from infectious diseases such as typhus, which was known as ship's fever. The largest Famine Irish mass grave in North America can be found on the site of Montreal's fever sheds, where over 6,000 Irish emigrants were buried. We can catch a glimpse of the horrors of the Irish famine migration by tracing the journey of one Roscommon family, the Floods, who, having lost their land and livelihood, fled Ireland in the spring of 1847. They were part of a group of 1,490 tenants from Strokestown Park House Estate in County Roscommon, whose passage fare to North America was paid by their landlord, Major Dennis Mann. In reality, they had little choice. Strokestown Park is now the home of the National Famine Museum in Ireland. Their departure under the name of James Flood, Sr. is recorded in one of the many handwritten immigrant lists that can be found in the Strokestown Park archive. These 1,490 former tenants from Strokestown Estate were escorted to Dublin by bailiff John Robinson along the Royal Canal.
Deep in your memory, deep in the dreaming, deep beneath the beating of your ancient heart, there burns a spirit, a strong, noble spirit. Remember, deep beyond memory, back before the dream, deep in the blood that is flowing through our bodies. We are the people, we are the children of the land, of the scholar and the poet. Remember our heritage, hold on to its beauty, keep alive the music of our native tongue, but don't forget our sorrows and all of our sadnesses. Reflect on all that we have overcome. If we can remember, we can try to understand. If we can understand, we can learn to forgive. If we can forgive, we can begin to grow. Remember, remember, remember.
Their sorrowful journey is commemorated and marked by the National Famine Way walking trail today. Mary and James Flood Sr. and their 9 children were among the first group of tenants that were evicted from the Strokestown estate and participated in a landlord-assisted emigration scheme. The first stage of their journey out of Ireland began with a 166-kilometre trek from Strokestown to Dublin along the Royal Canal. After several days of trudging cross-country and sleeping rough, the Floods and their neighbours arrived on the outskirts of the Irish capital, Dublin. From there, they were escorted by bailiff John Robinson to Custom House Quay on the River Liffey, where Major Mann's land agent waited to oversee their passage to Liverpool and Clarence Dock. From Liverpool, the flood sailed for 2 months on the Virginius, which would become one of the worst so-called coffin ships. 3 of the flood children, Bridget, Edward, and Mary Jr., who succumbed to typhus en route, were dropped overboard. By the time the Virginius laid anchor in the St. Lawrence River next to the Grosse Ile quarantine station on July 28th, 1/3 of its passengers had met the same fate. Those who survived were widely described as ghastly yellow specters. Ultimately, 267 of the 467 passengers on board the Virginius did not survive the voyage. When news of their horrific rate of death reached Strokestown, Major Dennis Mann was assassinated on November 2, 1847. He was the first landlord to be killed during the Great Hunger. 5-year-old James Flood Jr. was one of the few to survive the voyage in good health. Yet by the time he arrived in Montreal, he had lost both his parents. He never saw them again. James found himself alone in Montreal, a stranger in a strange land, arriving in a city stricken by disease. Like many of the Montreal famine orphans, James found refuge with the Grey Nuns in the Hôpital Général des Sœurs Grises. He was one of hundreds of famine Irish orphans cared for by the Grey Nuns of Montreal. This film tells their story.
As the wave of Irish refugees, 60,000 strong, cleared by Dr. Douglas and his volunteer medical staff, moved up the St. Lawrence River towards Montreal, a city of 54,000 citizens, it became increasingly obvious that typhus came with them.
The problem with the rickettsia bacteria and with typhus itself is that it's a very hardy bacteria. So it can live on blankets, it can live on beds, it can live on linens, it can even live in the dirt upon which those beds sit. And so every responder who takes in a victim is at great risk of contracting the disease themselves.
This building, close to the harbour in Old Montreal, was the original home of Margaret de Youville and her Sisters of Charity. They came to be known as the Grey Nuns. Today, it is the general house for the Congregation of Grey Nuns, with some rooms furnished as they were in 1847. The Grey Nuns were the first order to respond to the request to care for the Famine Irish, but not the last.
The summer of 1847 in Montreal was a summer like no other one since they had seen for many years before. There had been rumors that there were ships coming in from Grosse Ile with people who were very, very sick. And it seems that at the beginning of June of 1847, these ships arrived here in Montreal. And it's true, they were laden with people who were extremely ill from the typhus, and that became known as the typhus epidemic.
They didn't appear ill yet, but by the time they got down here to Montreal, they were ill. And they started coming off the boats, and they were on the shores there in what we sometimes call Point St. Charles. And they needed care. And the Sulpician priests asked the Grey Nuns to help.
The ships came in Montreal Harbour in what is now called Old Montreal, which would be right about here. And as you can see, it's just a very short walk into Griffintown and into the area where the sheds were. And in fact, at one point near the end of the summer, there was an attempt to have the ships bypass the wharves, and they came directly to this area where the hospital sheds were.
7 Grey Nuns perished in the fever sheds of Montreal in June and early July of 1847. They were replaced by a second order of nuns called the Sisters of Providence. They too suffered fatalities, and at the end of July, they were replaced by a third order of nuns called the Religious Hospitallers of St. Joseph. And what is remarkable about this is that the religious hospitallers of St. Joseph were a cloistered order of nuns, an order of nuns who never left their convent. And yet they petitioned the bishop, Bishop Bourget, to break their cloister, to leave their convent, and to go out into the city to replace their fallen sisters and to care for the famine Irish.
Alors, elles avaient déjà supplié Monseigneur d'aller les soigner. Et Monseigneur leur a dit à un certain moment que les sœurs grises étaient très épuisées. Peut-être qu'elles pourraient aller les soigner. Parce qu'après consultation, Monseigneur dit, le précepte de la charité l'emportait sur la loi de la clôture. Donc, c'est ça qui a permis aux sœurs d'aller les soigner et de permettre un répit aux communautés religieuses qui soignaient aussi les malades.
In the ceiling of the entrance to Bon Secours Church in Old Montreal is a painting called Le Typhus by Quebec artist Théophile Hamel. Bishop Ignace Bourget commissioned this visual account of the roles of the three congregations as they ministered to the Irish immigrants arriving in the port of Montreal. Dr. Jason King and Dr. Christine Kinealy mounted an exhibition called Saving the Famine Irish, based in large part on this eyewitness account of the roles of the Grey Nuns and the other congregations.
So the painting is fascinating on many levels. It's beautiful, it's evocative, it's painful in some ways to look at. And its origins lay in the fact that the Bishop of Montreal actually gave support to the sisters, and he contracted what was known as famine fever or Irish fever. And he was fortunate in that he survived. And so he commissioned a local artist in Montreal, a classically trained artist, to create this wonderful image to depict the story of what had happened. And it's on the ceiling of a church in Montreal to this day. So in some ways it's hard for the casual visitor to see. And it shows in fine detail the three religious orders.
What we see in that painting is the three orders of nuns working in succession to care for the famine Irish. In the foreground of the painting, we see the Grey Nuns. In the middle ground of the painting, we see the Sisters of Providence. And behind the Sisters of Providence, we see the Sisters of St. Joseph in the very back of the painting, with Bishop Bourget himself tending to one of the famine Irish.
But what makes this unique and so poignant is that you see scenes of death. And this is very unusual. In terms of 19th century art or photography, at this stage, people didn't want to depict suffering. Most artists had been taught in terms of high art. And so to actually see scenes like this is really unique. It probably is the first painting of the Great Hunger in the world, in terms of one that depicts the actual outcome of starvation.
It has been there since 1847, a very important painting, an eyewitness painting that depicts the arrival of the famine Irish, but also a painting that is almost completely unknown to famine scholars, to the public at large. So this exhibit, Saving the Famine Irish, is based around the painting, and what it does is it finds episodes, incidents, stories in the annals of the Grey Nuns and their correspondences with the visual images that we find in the painting.
While crossing the courtyard,
Reading from the Annals of the Grey Nuns, Sister Faye tells a story that is depicted very poignantly in the right corner of the Hamel painting, of an Irish man whose wife was sent on ahead to Montreal while he was recovering from typhus at Grosse Ile.
the inanimate body
Arriving
of
from
his
Grosse
wife,
Ile, he finds his
whom
wife among the
he was
dead
looking
in a
for
fever shed
all
in
this
Point St.
time.
Charles.
He takes her in his arms, seeming to doubt that she is in fact dead. He wants to bring her back to life, talks to her, calls her by her name, kisses her tenderly. But for all these demonstrations, the only answer he receives is death's silence.
So I think the beauty of that, and it's, I spoke to more than about the painting, but it was the solidarity among the congregations. We even know that Bishop Bourget went to help in the sheds also. and the mayor of Montreal, and so many people who collaborated to help these people. You know, I am very much in awe before our foremothers, because they didn't hesitate to go and help. They just wanted to be assured that they were doing the right thing with the proper authorities. And then once that was done, the Superior General came and talked to the community about it, and every one of the sisters volunteered to go help. Now that is awesome. I feel very proud of these women, of whom I'm a descendant, and that they would not hesitate in the face of such hardship. And so I just sense a lot of gratitude for their gift of self, and I say it's wonderful. It's wonderful what they did.
Mayor Mills was an amazing man. As the people were dying and immigrants continued to pour in, he saw the need for more hospitals, more hospital sheds to be built. Now the citizens by this time, by midsummer, were furious. They held, thousands would turn up at outdoor meetings and protests. There were rumors that they were going to take the existing sheds, set them on fire, throw them in the river. And the Board of Health wanted to move all of these people to an island 12 miles downstream, get them all out of the city. The Board of Health and influential citizens were pressuring Mayor Mills to get rid of the problem, to move it. Instead, he ordered more hospital sheds to be built on site, and he actually went out and physically helped construct the buildings and visited the sick, saying that it would be monstrous to even think of moving these people in that condition to another. So he stood up. He stood up to all this opposition. And unfortunately, he ended up losing his life. The story goes that although he had been going to the sheds every day throughout the summer, his wife one day in November hugged onto him, was crying and said, "Don't go." She had a horrible premonition that something was going to happen. And as it turns out, he did contract typhus and he died within a few days. But by that time, public opinion had turned, and his funeral was one of the most well-attended events in the history of Montreal.
The call of charity was ever the sweetest of all voices to his ear. So during those months his business lay neglected and his home knew him not. Go to the sheds at the midnight hour when doctors are seeking a moment's repose. The silence is unbroken except for the low moans of the dying, the rustling of rosaries, and the murmur of prayers. Behold a tall dark form which passes on from bed to bed, here smoothing the pillow beneath a fever-tossed young head, there lifting a cup to the parched lips of a strong man who smiles, "God bless you," through his burning pain. See him again in the morning dawn, pursuing his weary march from one shed to another, soothing, consoling, cheering, and helping. Now he stops to take a last message from a dying father for those he left behind in the dear green land, and again he lifts in his tender arms a little child who is unconsciously playing with her dead mother's hand. His splendid health bore out during all these trying months, and with early autumn the fever abated and hope returned. But one morning the people with troubled brows met and asked each other, "Where is the mayor?" Alas, in the pitiless throes of an agony of fever which, from the first, he knows he will never arise again. Despite these harrowing scenes, the Grey Nuns also recorded remarkable stories of Irish resilience and survival. They recount how a Galway widow named Suzanne Brown became separated from her youngest daughter Rose in Montreal's fever sheds after she had nearly succumbed to typhus, only to recover from her illness, having lost contact with her child. The annals record that she was born in Ireland to an affluent family who were stripped of their assets by misfortune. She was left widowed with her 3 children, George, Bridget, and Rose, and the courageous woman left her homeland to seek fortune abroad. She was traveling to Quebec with a group of Irish immigrants when she was struck down at sea by the contagion. From Quebec, she could nevertheless be transported to Montreal, but on her arrival, she became so sick that, as it was unlikely she would recover and as she seemed unconscious, we entrusted her son George to the parish priest of St. Hugues, her eldest daughter Bridget to the Grey Nuns, and Rose, her youngest, was adopted by a courageous Irish woman whose name we unfortunately did not retain before her mother returned to health against all odds. While convalescing under the care of the Grey Nuns, Suzanne Brown continued to search for her daughter until days and weeks passed with no clues to enlighten her. She also helped educate some of the Irish orphans whom the Grey Nuns had taken in. In the words of the annals, when she found herself surrounded by the orphans who absorbed her teachings like thirsty earth absorbs the dew, she thought of her little Rose. "If I had her here with me," she said, "I would teach her with all the others." With this weighing on her mind, one March evening, she attended a Holy Sacrament in St. Patrick's Church. In the silence of the ceremony, she was disturbed from her contemplation by the sound of a marble rolling on the floor, which came to rest in the folds of her clothes. She had barely raised her eyes when she saw a little girl, aged 3 or 4, running to collect it. "Is this not my little Rose?" she said, trembling with emotion. Indeed, it was this child who she mourned and thought she had lost forever, now returned to her at this moment by our Lord, and by instinct she reached out. However, her adoptive mother, who had missed nothing of what happened, intervened and protested. Before the ceremony had even finished, both women went to the sacristy to submit the case to Father Dowd. He did not delay in resolving the issue, and that very evening, Madame Brown triumphed, coming back to the refuge with little Rose. The reunification of Suzanne Brown with her daughter Rose attests to the broader role that the Grey Nuns played in caring for Irish emigrants and keeping their families together. This story of the miracle of Rose's marble is both remarkable and historically verifiable. The vast majority of the famine dead, buried in a mass grave on the site of Montreal's fever sheds, have left no trace of their existence. But the Grey Nuns kept meticulous records of the Irish orphans in their care. In their archival record on the category of orphans at Point St. Charles, dated March 19, 1848, Suzanne Brown and her 3 children, Bridget, aged 9, Rose, aged 7, and George are listed. The document stipulates that they are from County Galway and that their father, Michael, died in Montreal's fever sheds. Under the remarks column, the Grey Nuns also record that their mother was in the sheds and that both Bridget and Rose Brown have been placed at the Grey Nunnery with Mother. Indeed, it provides confirmation that the little girl who rolled her marble across the church floor was reunited with her mother shortly thereafter. The sisters also record that Rose's brother George was later ordained as a priest in the same parish of St. Hugues, where he found refuge, while Bridget did not leave the Grey Nuns until she went to establish herself in the world. As for Rose herself, her fate is not recounted after she found her mother.
The miracle of Rose's marble provides a reminder that all 6,000 immigrants who lie buried in Montreal's mass grave were such individuals with lives cut short. The Brown family story is just one that was passed on to subsequent generations. But as lovingly as the story of the first responders is recorded in the annals of the religious congregations, the only public memorial in Montreal is this black rock on an island between the on-ramps of the Victoria Bridge on the island of Montreal. The dedication reads, "To preserve from desecration the remains of 6,000 immigrants who died of ship's fever 1847-8. This stone is erected by the workmen of Messrs. Petto, Brassey and Best, employed in the construction of the Victoria Bridge. Anno Domini 1859.
And 6,000 plus people died right where we're standing. We're actually standing on the graves of our Irish ancestors. When they started to build the Victoria Bridge, the workers, many who were Irish, started unearthing bones. And when they started digging into the story, because it was 1859, not that long after 1847, so the story was still relatively in the modern conscious of the time, they decided to take this boulder and lay it as a headstone to the 6,000 plus Irish.
Not only did the Grey Nuns and other congregations, priests, and the mayor of Montreal come to help the Irish migrants at the fever sheds, but the people of Kinealy, a First Nations community on Montreal Island, offered to help with a donation, as explained by Chief Christine Zachary-Diome of the Mohawk Council.
So what is the connection between Kahnawake and the Irish? Well, we've been located throughout Montreal for centuries and for actually 10,000 years. And when you walk on the island of Montreal, you're really walking on Mohawk Nation territory. And the Mohawks live now across the river, across the St. Lawrence River. And we've been living across the St. Lawrence River for a long time, and throughout. We've been people who grew corn and lived all along there, all along this area. So how it came to be that we were considering what was happening, the famine, we were concerned about that. We were always people that were generous with our food. And so what we did was we started to gather monies together, not a great amount. We were as poor as anybody else. But we had, I think, $150 that we donated to famine relief.
Recently, the City of Montreal has embarked on a major light rail project, le Réseau Express Métropolitain, or the REM, a major public transit project that will make it much easier to move around the city. It'll have 26 stations and 67 kilometers of tracks across Greater Montreal. But its route will cross over what Montrealers call le cimetière irlandais, or the Irish cemetery marked by the Black Rock. So REM has been working with the Irish community to excavate the bodies from the site of one of its pillars. REM, in fact, redesigned the rail supports to have one rather than two pillars at this site. REM developed a custom-made basket that allowed archaeologists to remove the fragments of coffins and bones from the clay. They excavated the bones of a total of 14 people and will return these remains to the Irish community to bury at a later date. Here, Victor Boyle and Fergus Keys, representing the wider Irish community, meet with Elizabeth Boivin, the Assistant Director of Environment for REM, at St. Gabriel's Roman Catholic Church to reflect on the project. The City of Montreal and Hydro-Quebec, the provincial power utility, have been working with the Irish community to design and build a memorial park to honor the contributions of the Irish people to the city.
At the end of the summer in 1847, Montreal, 6,000 of them had died. Now, in the early days, they were buried in a very formal manner in coffins, etc. By the end of October, November of 1847, they were being buried in trenches somewhere around the area. Bodies were just being thrown in at the end of the day. When we were first approached by REM with the idea that they were going to actually put a pillar in the area that we always considered sacred, there were a wide range of emotions and discussions that went on.
But as we were hearing some of the suggestions you were making, not only did they fit in what we had hoped, they were better than we had hoped.
You gave us the opportunity to actually see the remains that were recovered from that area, and it was tremendously moving to us. Because now it's there, it's a person, I mean, it's somebody, you know, it's not one of 6,000. And every little bit of information makes it more real, you know.
It couldn't have been handled any more better than that.
Oh, wow, well, it's nice to hear.
We wanted to not only honor the Irish, but all the different peoples who came to help them in 1847 and who died helping. There was a Mohawk Nation, there were Jewish people, there was the Francophones, there were British soldiers, there was John Easton Mills, the mayor himself. So many people without any reason. They didn't know any of these people. They came down and they helped wherever they could. To me, it feels a lot like the Montrealers that helped the Irish that were sick and dying in 1847 are still here helping us Irish in 2020.
The Irish community is still alive and vibrant as it ever was, and to some degree even more, because 40% of the population of Quebec can claim some Irish heritage.
Except on St. Patrick's Day, when 100% of Quebecers claim Irish heritage.
Absolutely.